There are stories that fade with time. Stories that become nothing more than whispers, buried beneath years of silence. But some refuse to be forgotten. Some linger, waiting, watching, resurfacing when you least expect them. This is one of those stories. It begins in a town that few remember, in a house that no one dares to enter. A house that, for reasons unknown, has stood untouched for decades. Not abandoned, but avoided. The kind of place that children warn each other about, daring one another to step closer but never going in. The kind of place where windows seem darker at night, where the wind carries a weight that it shouldn't. For years there was nothing to explain the unease people felt. No deaths, no known crimes. Just an old house on the outskirts of town. But ask the right people, those who have lived here long enough, and they'll tell you about the night everything changed. A night when the silence became something else. A night when a girl walked through those doors and never walked back out. Her name was Sarah Caldwell. A quiet girl, intelligent, careful. The kind of person who didn't believe in ghosts, who didn't scare easily. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't the type to disappear without a trace. But she did. And what was left behind, what investigators found, or rather what they couldn't explain, became something far more terrifying than any ghost story. Because Sarah Caldwell didn't just disappear. She left something behind. A recording. A single video file recovered from her phone. A video with no sound. And in that silence, hidden beneath the grainy, distorted frames of that final footage, was something that would haunt everyone who saw it. Something no one could explain. Something no one could forget. This is the story of Sarah Caldwell. This is the story of a town that tried to erase its past. This is the story of a scream that no one heard. And if you listen closely, you still won't hear a thing. There are places on this earth that hold a presence. Something unspoken, something heavy. Places where silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's something more. A presence. A weight pressing down on the air itself. Black Hollow was one of those places. If you asked anyone from the outside, they would tell you there was nothing remarkable about it. A town like any other, just another forgotten place swallowed by time. No major landmarks, no tourist attractions. Just a stretch of land in the middle of nowhere, dotted with houses that seemed to have been built too close together, as if the people inside had been afraid of being alone. But the people who lived there, the ones who had been there long enough, knew better. They knew that something had always been wrong with this place. They never said it outright, never spoke of it in clear terms. But you could hear it in the way they talked, in the way their voices dropped to a whisper when certain topics were brought up. And then there were the rules. Every town has its own set of unspoken rules, small, superstitious things passed down from one generation to the next. But in Black Hollow, these rules weren't about folklore. They were about survival. Children were warned never to wander alone after dark. Doors were locked before the sun had fully set. And there was one rule above all others. A rule that was never questioned, never broken. No one ever stepped inside Hartley Manor. Not the children who dared each other on long summer nights. Not the teenagers looking for a thrill. Not even the town's most reckless drunks, stumbling home in the dead of night. The house had stood there for as long as anyone could remember. A relic from a time when things were different. When the town had been something else. No one knew exactly how long it had been abandoned. Or if it had ever really been abandoned at all. The records were strange, fragmented, incomplete. There was evidence that people had lived there, that families had come and gone. But if you looked closely, the details didn't make sense. Names that didn't match. People who had supposedly owned the house but had no surviving relatives, no burial records. It was as if history itself had been erased. And then there were the stories. Some said the house had once been an orphanage, though no one could prove it. Others swore it had been a boarding house, but no guests had ever been recorded. But no matter which version you heard, one thing was always the same. People who went in never stayed long. Some left town without a word, never to be seen again. Others simply stopped talking about what they had seen inside, as if their minds refused to hold on to the memory. And then one night something happened that no one could explain. A sound, or rather, the absence of one. A single moment in time when something should have been heard, but wasn't. A scream. A scream that no one heard. A scream that, if the stories are true, never should have existed at all. That was the night Sarah Caldwell walked through those doors. And never walked back out. Sarah Caldwell wasn't supposed to be a mystery. She wasn't the type of person who went looking for trouble. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't a thrill seeker. She was 22 years old. A student. Studying history at a university 2 hours away. She had come back to Black Hollow for the summer, just a few months to visit family before heading back to school. Her parents described her as quiet but thoughtful, observant, the kind of person who liked puzzles but only the ones she knew she could solve. She didn't believe in ghosts. She didn't believe in the stories people told about the house. And that, more than anything else, was probably what got her killed. June 17th. A warm, humid evening, the kind where the air clings to your skin, thick and heavy. Sarah had been out with a friend earlier that day. They'd driven to a nearby town, had lunch at a small diner. Nothing unusual. Around 8:45 p.m. she texted her best friend Amber. She sent a photo, Hartley Manor, taken from the street. A text followed. Going inside. Just for a minute? Amber responded almost instantly. Don't be stupid. It's just an old house. Exactly, Sarah replied. Just an old house. Those were her last known words. By morning, Sarah was missing. Her parents assumed she had stayed at a friend's house. Her friends assumed she had gone home. But by noon, calls were going unanswered. By 2 p.m., her father drove to the manor. Her car was still there. Keys still in the ignition. Driver's side door slightly open. Her phone was found a few feet away, lying face up in the dirt. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. Only one thing was missing. Sarah. There were no signs of a struggle. No footprints leading away. Nothing. As if she had simply stopped existing. But that wasn't the strangest part. Not by far. There was a single file on Sarah's phone. 1 minute and 42 seconds long. The last thing she ever recorded. Investigators watched it over and over. It began with darkness, then a sudden blur as she turned on her flashlight. The beam cut through the dust. A hallway stretched ahead, lined with doorways that yawned open like mouths. The house should have been empty. But something was wrong. Sarah's breath was visible in the air. A thin mist curled around her lips, dissipating into the shadows. It was the middle of summer. There was no reason for it to be cold. She moved forward. The floorboards groaned beneath her steps. A door ahead, slightly ajar. And then, a shift in the shadows. A shape, tall, too tall, just out of frame. The camera jolted as she turned. Nothing there. Just an empty hallway. But something had changed. Something was different. Then the final image. Sarah's face. Frozen in fear. Eyes wide, mouth open. A silent scream. And then, blackness. The video cut off. No sound. Not even static. Just nothing. Experts examined the video. They slowed it down, enhanced the footage. But no matter what they did, the result was always the same. No sound. It wasn't corrupted. It wasn't damaged. The phone's microphone was working perfectly before and after. But in that moment, at the precise second Sarah Caldwell should have screamed, there was nothing. Not even background noise. As if something had erased the very concept of sound from that space. As if, in that moment, the world had gone completely silent. Sarah Caldwell vanished without a trace. No body. No evidence. Only a single, impossible video. And a house that refused to give up its secrets. But the strangest part of all was that Sarah wasn't the first. And she wouldn't be the last. For weeks, the town of Black Hollow searched for Sarah Caldwell. They combed the fields. They drained the creek beds. They knocked on every door, asked every question. But there were no answers. No eyewitnesses. No leads. Only an empty house that swallowed her whole. And a single video that refused to explain itself. But then, something happened. Something no one expected. 3 weeks after Sarah disappeared, her phone sent another message. July 7th, 3:12 a.m. A notification appeared on Amber's phone. A text. From Sarah's number. Just 3 words. Please, help me. Amber sat up, heart hammering. She stared at the screen, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't possible. Sarah's phone had been in police custody for weeks. Turned off. Locked away in evidence. And yet, there it was. She tried to call. No answer. Just silence. A silence so heavy, so complete, it made her stomach twist. And then, another message. He won't let me leave. Amber's hands shook as she typed. Oh, where are you? No response. She waited. Minutes passed. Then, one last text. I can still hear you. And just like that, the line went dead. Amber ran to the police. They checked the phone records. Tracked the location. They expected an error, a dead signal, something explainable. But what they found was impossible. The message had been sent from inside Hartley Manor. From a phone that wasn't even on. A phone that had never left the evidence room. And yet, for exactly 2 minutes and 38 seconds, it had been active. sending messages from a place where no one should have been. Or at least, no one living. There was something else. Attached to the last message was a file. An audio recording. Only 7 seconds long. Investigators played it back. At first, it was nothing but static. Then, a faint whisper. A voice. Sarah's voice. "I can still hear you." A shuddering breath. Then, something else. Something behind her. A second voice. Oh, raspy. Just one word. "No." And then, silence. That was the last anyone ever heard from Sarah Caldwell. Her case remained open. Her family never stopped searching. But the truth was, everyone knew. She wasn't coming back. The house had taken her. And for reasons no one could understand. It had let her speak. Just once. Just long enough to remind them. She was still there. Still listening. And whatever was inside with her didn't want to let her go. After Sarah's disappearance, the town of Black Hollow changed. Not on the surface, of course. The stores still opened at the same time. The streets still bustled with the same tired rhythm. But beneath it all, something had shifted. People began to avoid Hartley Manor. Not just out of fear, but something more primal. Something deeper. The very thought of it seemed to unsettle them. You could feel it in the air like static before a storm. As if the house had become a living thing, watching them, listening to them, waiting for something. No one dared enter. No one dared speak its name aloud. And yet, it was impossible to ignore. Because despite everything, the truth remained. Someone, something, was still in there. It was 2 months after Sarah's last message when the photographs appeared. At first, no one knew where they had come from. A package arrived at the local police station, an unmarked envelope with no return address. Inside were several photographs. Each one was grainy, poorly lit, as though taken in the dark from a distance. But there was one thing that was unmistakable. In each photograph there was a figure. A figure in the background, hidden in the shadows, almost imperceptible. The figure was tall, unnaturally so. A silhouette that seemed too large for the space it occupied. In the first photo, it was standing in a doorway, barely visible, as if waiting for something. In the second photo, it was closer, now standing at the edge of a hallway, half concealed behind a broken pillar. In the third, it was directly behind Sarah. In the middle of the frame. Frozen in time, its shape unclear, its presence undeniable. The photos caused a stir, of course. They were sent to experts, analyzed and enhanced. The local authorities launched another investigation, but they didn't know where to start. Who had taken the pictures? Where had they been taken? And most importantly, who was that figure? Some theorized it was an intruder, someone hiding in the house, lurking in the shadows. But that theory fell apart the moment they realized one thing. None of the pictures had been taken from inside the house. Each photograph had been taken from the same spot, across the street. Taken from outside the house. Someone, somewhere had been watching. And the chilling implication was impossible to deny. The figure in the photos, whoever, or whatever, was still in there. It had never left. It wasn't until the following year that the truth began to emerge, though. A witness came forward. A man named Thomas Hawk. He wasn't a local, not originally. He had moved to Black Hollow just a few months before Sarah disappeared, looking for work after losing his job in the city. He had no connection to the Caldwell family, no reason to become involved in their tragedy. And yet, on the night Sarah went missing, Thomas had been there. He wasn't at the manor. He wasn't on the street. But he had been close enough to see something he could never explain. Thomas hadn't spoken for months, not about what he had seen. But one evening, after a few too many drinks, he found himself at a bar with an old acquaintance. And in a moment of strange, painful honesty, he told the story. He had been walking home that night, back to his apartment, when he saw something strange in the distance. Hartley Manor. The house, always dark, always silent, wasn't dark that night. He had seen lights flickering in the upper windows. Movement. And then he saw her. Sarah Caldwell. Standing in the window. He could see her clearly. Her face pressed to the glass. Her eyes wide, her mouth open as if screaming. But there was no sound. Not a single sound. Not even a breath. Just a quiet, terrible silence. He had tried to approach. He had walked closer to the house. But as he did, something changed. The lights went out. The shadows swallowed the window. And Sarah was gone. He stood there for hours, staring at the house, waiting for something to happen. But it never did. No one came. Nothing moved. And when he left, he swore he could still feel her eyes watching him, even from a distance. And then, the message came. The strange, unexplainable message. the one that had come from Sarah's phone. A message that, according to Thomas, had been the last thing he ever wanted to hear. In the end, Thomas Hawk's testimony wasn't enough to unravel the mystery. The photos, those chilling photographs, were never fully explained. The figure in the shadows, the silence that clung to the house, the strange phenomena that followed. The people of Black Hollow had long since learned to accept one thing. Some things were better left alone. Hartley Manor, like so many dark places before it, became a symbol of something unspeakable. Not just a house, but a witness. And perhaps that was the most terrifying truth of all. That some stories don't need to be told. They just need to be watched. In the years following Sarah Caldwell's disappearance, the town of Black Hollow tried to move on. They did what people do when they are confronted with things they cannot explain. They ignored it. They swept it under the rug. They pretended the house wasn't there. But even as time passed, there were those who knew the truth that couldn't be erased. Hartley Manor was no ordinary house. It wasn't simply a home that had fallen into disrepair. It wasn't just a relic of the past, haunted by stories told in hushed tones. No, Hartley Manor was something far darker, something far older, and something far more dangerous. To understand what Hartley Manor was, one had to understand its past. The house wasn't built in the 1800s. It wasn't even built in the 1700s. The records on the manor's origins were sparse, incomplete, almost deliberately so. But one thing was certain. The land itself had a history long before any of the town's settlers arrived. It had been a sacred place, a site of rituals that predated any written word. Ancient, forgotten forces had been worshipped there. For centuries, long before the house had ever been constructed, people in Black Hollow had whispered of the spirits that inhabited the land. The ones that didn't show themselves. The ones that waited. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for the right person. And over time the house was built on that same land. The land that held its secrets in the soil, in the stone, in the very air. From the beginning the house had been something else. It wasn't just the photographs or the strange disappearances that proved Hartley Manor wasn't like other places. It was the changes in the environment itself. Small, almost imperceptible at first. Temperature fluctuations. Shadows that stretched in unnatural ways as though they had their own will. There were reports of whispers in the wind, voices just on the edge of hearing, too soft to make sense of but loud enough to unsettle. Windows that slammed shut with no breeze. Doors that opened and closed on their own, as if an unseen force had a mind of its own. It became impossible to ignore the fact that something was moving inside the house. But there was no sign of anything. No physical presence. No evidence of human activity. And yet, every single person who ventured into the manor reported the same thing. They felt it. That oppressive presence. That weight in the air. That feeling like they were being watched. They were never alone. In early 2005, another strange incident occurred. A local teenager named Josh Parker had heard the rumors about Hartley Manor. He'd heard the stories of ghosts and disappearances, but like many of the younger generation, he didn't believe in such things. He was determined to prove that the house was just an old, decaying structure with no more life left in it. One night, he gathered a group of friends and they made their way to Hartley Manor. They had their cameras. They had their flashlights. They had their courage. Josh was the first to enter the house. He pushed open the front door, which creaked and groaned in protest. At first, nothing happened. The house was silent, save for the occasional rustle of the wind outside. They moved deeper into the manor, exploring room after room. But as they entered the old dining room, something shifted. The air became heavier. It became harder to breathe. And Josh felt it first. A cold, invisible pressure on his chest. It wasn't the cold of winter or the chill of an old building. It was something different. A cold that seeped into his bones. It wasn't until he turned around that he realized something was wrong. His friends were nowhere to be seen. He called out for them, but there was no answer. Then just as quickly the house seemed to respond. The door slammed shut behind him. A loud bang that made the walls shake. Josh spun around, panic rising in his throat. His heart pounded in his ears. But when he turned back to the door, he saw something in the glass. An image, distorted, warped, like a reflection that shouldn't exist. A hand. A long, bony hand with fingers that stretched impossibly far. It reached out toward him. Josh froze, his breath caught in his throat. He backed away from the door, the image still lingering there. The hand kept reaching. But Josh didn't wait to see if it would touch him. He turned and ran. The police were called. The manor was searched again. Josh and his friends were found outside, disoriented but alive. They claimed they had never seen anyone, nothing physical, inside the house. But they were shaken. They refused to speak further about what they had seen. It wasn't just the cold. It wasn't just the shadows. It was the feeling of something else. A presence they couldn't explain. And the marks they discovered on Josh's arms, long, thin scratches as if made by something with talons, something not human, confirmed what they had felt. The unseen forces within Hartley Manor had made their presence known. By now, the people of Black Hollow knew better than to go near Hartley Manor. The stories had grown. The whispers had become warnings. And the house, never truly abandoned, waited as always in the silence. But it wasn't just a house anymore. It had become a legend. A place where the laws of nature seemed to bend, where the air itself seemed to hold memories. Memories of things that were never meant to be remembered. And for some, the house held the answers. But for others, it held a warning to never enter. Because the forces inside were far more than just shadows. They were the things that lived in the quiet places, the spaces between breaths. And when they were hungry, they took more than just the living. It had been years since Sarah Caldwell disappeared. Years since the photographs had surfaced. Years since the strange occurrences at Hartley Manor had begun to intensify. And still no one had uncovered the truth. No one had truly understood what lay within that house, what had been hiding in the shadows all along. But now there were no more excuses, no more delays. The time had come. It was a stormy night when they came. Two young men, desperate for answers. Adam and Jake, friends from the town who had spent years trying to unravel the mystery of Hartley Manor. They had heard the rumors, read the stories, seen the photos. But they had never been inside. They had always been cautious, always afraid of the unknown. But tonight was different. The storm outside had rattled the town, and with it came the feeling that something big was about to happen. The two men gathered their courage and made their way to Hartley Manor. It was as if the house itself had been waiting for them. Waiting for the moment they would step over the threshold. The moment they would unlock the door and enter the dark space that had claimed so many before them. When they pushed open the front door, it creaked and groaned, almost as if it were a living thing waking after years of slumber. The air inside was thick, musty, heavy with dust and decay. But there was something more. A strange, magnetic pull, like an invisible force drawing them in. They stood in the foyer, feeling the weight of the house settle around them. The shadows clung to the walls, twisting and stretching in the flickering light of their flashlights. Adam moved forward first, his steps slow, deliberate. Jake followed behind, his breath shallow, nervous. There was a stillness in the air. A quiet that wasn't quite right. It was as though the house was holding its breath, waiting. As they ventured deeper into the manor, the temperature began to drop. Their breath became visible, hanging in the air like fog. The silence was suffocating. Until a sound, a faint creak from the upstairs, followed by a low, almost imperceptible whisper. They froze. They both turned their heads toward the source of the sound. But the house was still. Too still. No sign of movement. Nothing. And yet they felt it. A presence. Behind them. A cold breath against the back of their necks. A faint brush of air as if something, was standing just a few feet away watching them. They turned quickly but saw nothing. Nothing but shadows. Nothing but the feeling of being seen. They made their way up the staircase, the boards creaking beneath their weight. The upstairs was darker than they had expected. The air, now thick with an otherworldly coldness, made it hard to breathe. The shadows seemed deeper up here, as though the house had swallowed the light whole. They entered the hallway. And then, the door at the end of the hall, the one that had always been locked, was open. It was an old study. Inside, a single candle flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. And there, standing at the far side of the room, a figure. A tall, looming figure, barely visible in the low light. It was motionless. But somehow Adam and Jake knew, deep in their bones, that it was alive. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. But it didn't have to. The room felt suffocating, as if the air had been stolen from them. Jake's hand reached for Adam's arm. "Adam, we have to leave." But Adam wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on the figure. And then, slowly, like a puppet being controlled from strings, the figure moved. It took one step, then another. Each movement deliberate, unnervingly slow. Adam's heart pounded in his chest. Jake. But before he could speak again, the figure turned its head, locking eyes with Adam. Eyes that weren't eyes at all. Empty. Black. A void. And in that moment, Adam understood. This wasn't a person. It wasn't even a ghost. It was something else. Something that had never been alive. The ground beneath them seemed to shift. The walls groaned as though they were about to collapse. A low hum filled the room, vibrating in their bones. The figure stepped forward, its shape becoming clearer, more defined with each passing second. And as it moved, the shadows twisted around it, alive in ways they should not be. The room seemed to close in on them. Time felt like it was warping. And then, a deafening crash. The doors slammed shut. The windows shattered. Everything in the house seemed to buckle, as if the very structure itself were coming undone. Adam and Jake were thrown back, their bodies slammed into the walls. And then, darkness. The next morning, the storm had passed. The town of Black Hollow woke up, just like any other day. But when the authorities arrived at Hartley Manor, they found only silence. No sign of Adam. No sign of Jake. The house had swallowed them whole. Not a trace remained. Just the shadows. And the whispers of those who had been there before. Hartley Manor stood empty again. But the truth had already been sealed. The house, the land, the forces that had been waiting for centuries. They had claimed their final victims. The final hour had come. And with it, the final silence. Hartley Manor remains to this day an enigma. A place where the boundaries between the living and the dead are blurred. Where time itself bends and shadows move in ways they should not. For some, it's just a house. But for those who dared to enter, it is a reminder that there are things in this world that cannot be explained. Things that should never be looked at too closely. Because once you do, you may never leave. If you found this chilling tale of Hartley Manor unsettling, then you're not alone. The dark and unknown still linger in the corners of our world, waiting to be discovered or avoided. If you want to hear more spine-tingling stories, uncover hidden mysteries, and delve into the depths of the unexplained, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. And if you're brave enough, leave us a comment sharing your thoughts. Do you think Hartley Manor was truly haunted? Or was there something even darker at play? Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and keep your eyes open, because some stories are more real than they seem.